Good morning. The last 3 or 4 weeks, Pastor Ray has been talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. We've celebrated his resurrection this month. And this morning we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about Jesus. Before we talk about him, let me tell you why we read those scripture verses this morning and where they came from. Some years ago, my wife and I were going out to dinner one night, and we didn't have time to wait on a private table, so we decided to sit at the counter. And in doing so, you've got people on both sides of you. I had a man on my left, and she had somebody on her right. And through the course of the meal, I started talking to the guy on the left. And the conversation led from one thing to another, and it came to the subject of Jesus. Who he was, did he exist, and was he real? And I quoted some of the verses that you just heard. When we left the restaurant, I wasn't very happy about it because I didn't feel as though the truth had gotten through to this man. And I said to my wife, I don't really believe that he understood what I was saying. And she said, I don't really think what you were saying was for him. Because the guy that was sitting on his left was the one that was really listening to the conversation. And it was very interesting that, that she would notice that. But this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to be that second guy on the left and listen to that conversation. We're going to continue that conversation with a personal evaluation by each of us about who Jesus is. And perhaps you will take the position of the second man on the left as we talk about it this morning. But before we get into the details of the scriptures, let us understand where the world is right now in their perception of Jesus, the Bible, and God. When I did some research on this subject, it's very interesting to find out what the statistics say on certain poll results. A Gallup poll was done back in 1948. Which is before I was born, about 61 years ago. And that poll asked the question, are you a Christian? And this is to Americans. And the poll result was 91% of those polled said they were Christians. About 9 out of 10 people. The same poll was conducted in 2009 by the Gallup Research Company. And it came back 77% of Americans said they were Christians. So about 8 out of 10. Another poll was conducted in 2006 that asked a different question. Do you believe in God? Do you believe that there is a God? Do you believe that God exists? And that came back with only 73% of Americans saying that they believe that God exists. So putting those two things together, we can surmise that at least 7 out of 10 people believe that God exists and call themselves Christians. So that's not too bad. But let's look at that a little bit closer. A Barna poll that was done asking a different question that sort of nailed it down, which is where we're at this morning. As an American, how many people believe in a biblical worldview? Now, let me describe what a biblical worldview is first of all. A biblical worldview would mean that you believe that the earth was created in 6 days. A biblical worldview would mean that you believe that marriage was between one man and one woman. A biblical worldview would mean that Jesus rose from the dead in 3 days. Premarital sex is wrong. Divorce is wrong. Jesus is God. You get the point. It's specific. It's laid out word for word in the Bible as to what a biblical worldview is. And that's why they call it a biblical worldview. So, getting back to the poll that was conducted on a biblical worldview, out of the number of Americans that were asked that question over 14 years in 4 surveys, on average, only 9% of them responded saying they had a biblical worldview. 1 out of 10. Out of those that said they were Christians, only 20% said they had a biblical worldview. Only 2 out of 10. So the numbers sharply decrease when the rubber meets the road. So here we have a sampling this morning of Americans and Christians, and if we were to even double those numbers, we would still be in the minority. So the question is this morning that you will indeed ask yourself is, what category do you put yourself in? But don't try to answer that until we've looked at the facts that I'll present to you this morning. Who is Jesus? Or who was Jesus? Did Jesus exist at all? And where do we find the answers to this? First, let's look at something outside of the Bible. Let's look at something that the world would put credibility to. And then I will point back to the Bible once this is done. There was a man whose name was Flavius Josephus, who was a Jewish historian that lived at the time of Jesus. Josephus wrote this about Jesus. He was not a Christian, was not a prophet, but he wrote this about Jesus. And I quote, "About this time, Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was an achiever of extraordinary deeds, and was a teacher of those who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and Greeks. He was the Messiah. When he was indicted by the principal men among us, and Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, restored to life, as the prophets of the deity had foretold. And the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day." This is not in the Bible. This is a historical account of that time by a historian that was a Jew. Why is it so important? Because it clearly shows there's evidence outside of the Bible for Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Documented fact. Then, from that, I point to this book. It can be believed cover to cover. If that one fact is recorded outside of it, then obviously the rest of it's true too. Very simple. Because in the Bible, the Old Testament talks about looking towards the cross, and the New Testament talks about looking back at the cross, all wrapped around Jesus. I know that's an oversimplification, but it's true nevertheless. So who else do you think would be a better witness to tell us about this? Why, Jesus himself, which is where we'll go to in our program today. John 14, 6 through 7. Let's begin there, and we'll read those verses. Ready? Begin.
Jesus answered, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him."
Thank you. Let's back it up to verse 1 of that chapter a little bit. Jesus is trying to comfort his disciples. They know what's going to happen. They have a feeling that their entire life is going to change. They've spent the last 3 years with him. They've learned that he's going to bring in a new kingdom. They're looking for an earthly kingdom, but all of a sudden it looks like he's going to be pulled out from underneath them. They're fearful. They're apprehensive. You can probably equate that to the same fear and apprehensive that people have today, that they may lose their job or their house or any other thing. But things are going to change drastically, and they know that. And he says in verse 1, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." Those of you who listen to Sean Hannity, that's one of his favorite statements, and I wonder whether he realizes he's speaking the word when he says that.